Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the final episode in our series on Christmas podcast. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Here's my caffeine. At the beginning, coffee, say it with me, and lo, it was very good. Well, today is episode, our essay number 4 of my essays in Christmas, and today we're going to be talking about the Magi. This, frankly, is a subject that's always confused me a little. Why would these non-Hebrew people ride 3 camels to Bethlehem to visit a poor Jewish man, his wife, and a baby, give them expensive gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh, and then ride away again? Let's read Matthew's description first, and then we'll get into it. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is he? Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Now we saw a star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Okay, that's Matthew's take on it. Who are the Magi? Well, the caste of the Magi, and there were a caste in Persia, the caste of the Magi may be traced back in scriptures to Babylon during and after the exile. In Babylon, they were first known as the wise men. This included magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. You can find that in Daniel. Now, in the Counselor magazine, December 1990, and the Preacher's magazine, updated with expanded information in 2013, we read the following. Philo of Alexandria, or Philo. Can't remember. We'll go with Philo. Philo of Alexandria, who lived 20 BC to 50 AD. He was a Jewish philosopher living around the time of Jesus. He wrote favorably about an Eastern school of Magi in his writing, and the writing was titled "Every Good Man is Free." He placed them among the Persians. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, became a believer in the Hebrew God in Daniel chapter 4. Before this, he had appointed Daniel as chief minister over all of Babylon's sages, all of his wise men. This meant that Daniel, the Jewish prophet, had leadership over those who would later be termed the Magi. Daniel 2 again. It's possible that Daniel taught Hebrew scriptures and messianic prophecies to the other sages, especially to those who were Jewish. A Jewish tradition even claims that Daniel founded an order of Magi and instructed them to watch for the Messiah through the generations. This is very likely because of what we see in the knowledge and response to the Magi that appear at the time of Christ. They were not uninformed. It's clear from Daniel chapters 2 that Daniel and his friends, you've heard of them before, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were considered part of this caste of men known as the wise men of Babylon, who were to be advisors to the king on a great breadth of subjects, including religion, science, philosophy, and politics. They were a mixture of various religions and disciplines. Now, when the Persian Empire, Darius, conquered the Medes, Nebuchadnezzar, there was a priestly caste among the Medes, again, that's Darius, the king, known as the Magi. And when the Medo-Persians conquered Babylon, as recorded in the 5th chapter of Daniel, as well as in secular history, they brought this Magi caste with them. It's clear from the biblical historical record that Daniel was one of those from among the wise men of Babylon who were absorbed into this class. From this class of men came many of the satraps that Darius appointed to help rule this diverse kingdom. Daniel was chosen as one of the 3 administrators to whom the 120 satraps chosen by this Medo-Persian king were accountable. It was Darius's plan, as expressed in verse 3 of the 6th chapter, to put Daniel over the whole kingdom, which seems to have been done after the Den of Lions event in Daniel chapter 6. By all accounts, Daniel was a very powerful and influential member of the Magi. The Magi who appeared during the birth of Christ are most likely members of a sect of Magi that followed the teachings, prophecies, and the God of this most famous of the ancient Magi, Daniel. Many of the Magi were possibly Jewish, as many of the Jews did not return to Israel when offered the opportunity. Daniel himself did not return from the exile, but remained in Babylon, likely too advanced in years to consider returning. And it's reasonable that many of those within the caste of the Magi who were Jewish didn't return, as their positions of power and responsibility would have given them a life that they would have chosen over the hardships of those who returned to the destroyed city of Jerusalem. Thus, they remained part of the diaspora, which continued into the time of Christ, and even now into our day, as many Jewish people continue to live as Jews outside of Israel. That's what the diaspora is. Therefore, it's likely that many of the Magi of this school, Daniel's school, if you will, were Jewish, though not necessarily all. And these would have been followers of the true God of the Jews, as Daniel allowed no other. They would have been familiar with and possessed in-depth knowledge of the writings of the prophet Daniel, which would have been their revered founder and prophet. God still has his chosen people outside of Israel, influencing the world, and Daniel was one of those. These Magi, they preserved the words of God in Daniel's prophetic book, and when called upon to act, acted upon it, as we will see. Daniel had given them a timetable by which they would know when the Messiah would appear. All right, let's get to that. How did they know where and when Jesus was to be born? Well, first of all, we need to realize there's two important sources of information that would have been important to these Magi from the Eastern School. First, they would have followed the insights given them in the prophecies of Daniel concerning the timing of Messiah's birth and death. The most important of these is the 9th chapter of Daniel, where the angel Gabriel gives Daniel a cryptic calendar organized according to the sacred system of heptads, that's 7-year cycles, and patterned forward on the structure of the exile which the Jews were about to complete, and which Daniel had read in the prophet Jeremiah would be 70 years long and was about to be completed in Daniel's old age. Therefore, this is the reason Daniel falls and prays for the restoration of Jerusalem in the first part of chapter 9. It is in this context that God sends Gabriel to reveal to Daniel the calendar of heptads, groups of 7 years, and gives him an understanding of the organization, how they will unfold in the future. It's here that we get our first clue into the answer to the questions to the incredible understanding that these Magi had concerning the timing of the appearance of Messiah and the purpose of his coming. These men were light years ahead of even the best theologians of Jerusalem, who seemed to be totally ignorant concerning the signs of the times, something Jesus would reprimand them for in the days of his ministry. Go to Matthew 16 for that. These Jerusalem theologians were equally confused concerning the nature of Jesus' mission, something that the Magi seemed to obviously understand. Many point to Balaam's fourth oracle as recorded in Numbers, especially that part in verse 17 which says, "A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel," as the point of revelatory insight for these Magi. While they were no doubt aware of this prophecy by itself, even with the appearance of the star and its placement in the constellations, it was hardly enough to cause them to set out on a long and dangerous expedition like they did. There had been other great stars and heavenly wonders, but this star became significant to the Magi because of a prophetic timetable. The prophecy from Gabriel to Daniel pointed to the current time for the birth of the Messiah, and that, coupled with the star's appearance, caused the Magi to take heed and proceed to Bethlehem, or Jerusalem, as the case may be. These Magi further demonstrated their great learning and knowledge of the Messiah and his mission by the gifts they brought. Gifts were always brought to a king or an important official. They were chosen to demonstrate the knowledge and estimation of the givers concerning their host. Since the Magi spent nearly a year finding their young king, they arrived perhaps as much as 2 years after the birth of Jesus, you can be sure that such devotion had been thought out carefully concerning the meaning of the gifts they were to bring. Gold was a common gift for a king. By this, they declared their understanding of his royal lineage, both earthly and heavenly. Incense was offered only to a god. Pagan kings, declaring themselves God, often demanded incense from their subjects. And by this act, they declared their understanding that he was Emmanuel, which means God with us. By bringing myrrh, the bitter herb of death and burial, they revealed their understanding of Daniel's prophecy that the Anointed One would be cut off, put to death, after a certain number of years. They knew he was a sacrifice for the sins of mankind, king, God, and sacrifice, all in one. These men stand out as a sharp rebuke to the ignorance of their day. All could have known and responded as they did, but they weren't watching the signs of the prophetic skies, nor were they properly reading and applying the knowledge of the scriptures, which pinpointed his coming and his death, and resulting as resurrection, like they would find in Daniel's prophecy. So the Magi would have known that from the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the time of the Anointed One, the ruler, is killed, would be a fixed number of years, 430 years or something like that. And so it makes sense that they would just backtrack from that time to estimate the birth. You know when he died. You can have a ballpark figure of when he was to be born. So maybe they just counted back 30 years or so from Jesus' death to get a general idea of when Jesus would have been born. And that would have sent them on their journey to find this King of the Jews. There was a star, and there was a prophecy, and there was a calendar. They did the math, saw the star, set out on their journey. But they don't know exactly where he is yet. Their only point of reference is Jerusalem. They don't know about Bethlehem. So they just go back to where it all began, with the interaction between Babylon and Israel, and that was Jerusalem. The Magi, therefore, understood the general timing of Messiah's birth and the sign that would lead them to the place where he would be born. That is, they calculated the date of his death, counted backwards to get a general understanding of when his birth might be. That the Magi would have gone to Jerusalem makes sense, as they would need to ask about the specifics as to exactly where the King of the Jews would specifically be. Jerusalem, being the capital city, makes it the logical place to go. Why was Herod upset by the appearance of the Magi? Well, the Magi were so powerful in their culture that historians like Herodotus tell us that no person in their kingdom, Persia, was ever able to become king except under two conditions. The king had to master the scientific and religious knowledge and discipline of the Magi, and he had to be approved of and crowned by the Magi. In fact, they were in such control of who became king that they were sometimes referred to as kingmakers. Let's do a little bit more digging. Politically speaking, Rome was strategically concerned with the Eastern Empire of Parthia, Persia. Rome had stretched its tentacles out to rule the world, but it never really felt secure about the Parthian Empire because it never conquered them. Israel, which was situated between these two powers, actually became a battleground between these violent enemies in 63, 55, and 40 BC. Rome's anxiety over the Eastern Empire was accurately reflected in Herod's response to the arrival of the Magi in Matthew 2 and 3. In fact, the NIV translated, when he saw the Magi, Herod was greatly disturbed. We'll get to that in a minute. These Magi represented a powerful class in the Eastern Empire of Parthia, which Rome had never defeated, as I said. According to John MacArthur, they wouldn't come in riding camels. They would be accompanied by a contingent of Persian cavalrymen as their escort. All right, this was a military cohort. So with a military escort of Persian cavalry protecting them, these Magi show up in Jerusalem and they seek Herod. And they ask a question: where is the King of the Jews? Now here's the problem. Herod is the Roman appointed King of the Jews. These Magi were in a sense saying, where's the King of the Jews? Oh, by the way, you're not him. And this explains why Herod, the self-absorbed ruler of the Jews, would be disturbed. A military contingent with some magi from an empire that Rome has a conflict with in the past shows up asking questions about another king. When Herod, the king, heard these words, he was troubled. NIV calls it greatly disturbed. The Greek word for troubled conveys the idea that he was agitating. He was quivering with a combination of rage and fear. Rage because they weren't recognizing him as the king of the Jews. Fear because of who they were. And he was not prepared to deal at that moment with Persian military. One of Rome's most fearsome opponents was literally on his doorstep. Then he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, asking, "Where's the Messiah to be born?" And as you heard before, they told him in Bethlehem in Judea. And that was the last piece of information that the Magi needed. And so they went off to Bethlehem, arriving perhaps as late as 2 years after his birth. So that kind of puts a different spin in this whole story about the Magi, doesn't it? First of all, they represented a class of people from an enemy of Rome that were known to be kingmakers. I don't think they were there to make Jesus a king. He wasn't Persian. They were going to come and worship the one that their predecessor Daniel had told them about all those centuries before. They were fulfilling a duty and a mission that, in effect, Daniel had given to them some 400 years previous. Matthew says they worshipped him, and they gave his parents gold, frankincense, and myrrh, very expensive spices and gold. And they honored this one who would be the true king of Jews, the Messiah. And when the wise men got there, Joseph and Mary, we find, were living in a house. They'd moved out. They couldn't stay in the stable, of course. These Magi may or may not have been of Hebrew descent. As I said before, many Jews did not return to Israel. When they were allowed to return from the Babylonian captivity, many, like Daniel, stayed behind in Babylon. Daniel had given them the math they needed to calculate when the Messiah, the King of the Jews, would be born. God gave them a star to follow, and between Daniel's math and God's star, these Magi set out to find Jesus. And then, of course, they give frankincense, gold, and myrrh to Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph would need those to pay the bills when they fled from Herod. All right, let's have a Reader's Digest condensed version of the story of the birth of Jesus. 1. Mary has a visitation with Gabriel. 2. She goes to see Elizabeth. 3. She comes home 3 to 6 months pregnant. 4. Joseph takes her as his wife even though she's pregnant with a child other than his own. 5. He takes her to Bethlehem with him. 6. Nobody in Bethlehem gives him a place. 7. They find a cave or a manger to give birth in. 8. The Levitical shepherds found him the night he was born. And 9. The Magi arrive, possibly 2 years later, with them living in a house. With the shame that her world would heap upon her and Joseph and Jesus, they couldn't return to Joseph's home immediately. As a result, they were poor. Nobody will give them help. They stay in a stable. They find a little house. The wise men bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then they have to flee to Egypt to get away from Herod, because Herod is getting ready to kill Jesus. He's absolutely going to come down on Bethlehem like a ton of bricks to find and kill this newborn king of the Jews. The gifts that the Magi gave would have supported this family during the next 4 to 5 years until they could come back home to Nazareth. And we'll pick up this story approximately 30 years later, when a certain rabbi named Jesus begins to dance the dance that would bring us redemption. But that's another story for another time. This is indeed the greatest story ever told. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Indeed. And with that, we finish the Christmas story. Mary, Joseph, Jesus, the shepherds, the Magi. It is the greatest story ever told. Merry Christmas. God's blessings to you and yours. Here's my coffee. And folks, I'm out of here. Have a glorious day. Bye. I have begun to publish my Bible studies on Amazon, make them available on Amazon. And if you were to go to Amazon.com and type my name in the search bar in Amazon, Paige Garwood, you're going to see one of the books that I've got there. You're going to see, right, like for instance, the first one that shows up, Essays and Beatitudes. Underneath it says part of, it's a series, part of a series of essays in. You click on that, and then you have the collection of books that I've got done so far. As you can see, I've got Essays in Ruth, Essays in Beatitudes, Essays in Revelation, the 7 churches of Asia Minor, Essays on Christmas, which is where this podcast comes from. Each one of these are based on the podcast series that I did related to this topic. And as you can see, some are available via Kindle, some are available only in print. I'm looking to fix all that, make sure everything's available in both types. But it's available there for you to purchase. And I've written them in 8.5 by 11 size notebooks, so there's room to write in because these are Bible studies. So feel free to go to Amazon.com and purchase these. You will be helping support me in my ongoing ministry with my Bible study writings that I'm doing, and I would be very grateful. If you wish to become a supporter of these Bible studies, then go to www.patreon.com/coffeebiblepage. For $5 a month, you will get access to each and every transcript of every podcast I produced in the past and will produce in the future. And when I turn them into books, you will get access for no additional cost to the PDF version of those books. Also, don't forget to go to Facebook and do a search on Paige's Bible Study Group. It's a private group, and if you promise to behave, I'll let you come in and chat with the rest of us where we discuss the different Bible studies I've done and the different Bible studies that are coming. Have a glorious and God-blessed day. Bye-bye.